The committee will reconvene. I know we said 4:30, but we have some members up here that are anxious, and I know the second panel has been waiting, and I appreciate your waiting. We have on the second panel Joel Bozeman from Sublet Commission in Pinedale, Wyoming. I hope I said that correctly? Did I say that correctly?
Mr. Chairman, it's Bozeman, but that's close enough.
All right. Well, you could have been in Montana, and I would have, said Bozeman. I would have been correct. So. Mike McKee from Uinta County Commissioner in Vernal, Utah. Leslie Robinson, Phillips County Commissioner in Malta, Montana. Dennis C.W. Smith from Jackson County Commissioner in Jackson County, Oregon. William G. Myers III, a partner in Holland and Hart and a former solicitor of the Interior Department. Peter Medcalf, CEO and President of Black Diamond Equipment, and Mike Squillacha. I say it correctly? Squillachi. Okay. Well, you told me when I introduced myself, and I thought I might blow it. I just want to remind all witnesses I mentioned to the first panel that your full written statement will appear in the record, and you have the 5-minute lights there. The green light will signify 4 minutes, the yellow light meaning 1 more minute, and of course the red light, you're done. So if you could hold it to 5 minutes, I'd appreciate it. This time I'd like to ask unanimous consent that Mr. Walden from Oregon be able to participate in the panel. Without objection, so ordered, and I'd recognize Mr. Walden for the purpose of a introduction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for that, and to my colleagues on the committee, thank you for letting me sit with you. It's good to be home. This is a committee I served on for many years and enjoyed the work on, very important to especially the rural West. I'm honored today to introduce the Jackson County Commissioner, C.W. Smith. CW has been on the Jackson County Commission in Oregon since 2005 and is current chairman of the commission. He was a sheriff before that from 1983 to 1995 and was voted Oregon Sheriff of the Year for 89 to 90. He also served as Jackson County Sheriff's Administrative Service Division Captain from 03 to 04. He's a Vietnam veteran in the Air Force. He was interim city manager in Lakeview and police chief for the city of Talent. And most importantly, Mr. Chairman, he's a former radio talk show host. Some of us really admire that quality in a person. Private insurance business owner and manager of a large farming organization. CW represents the largest by population county in my district, and where we've had to deal with presidential designations of monuments and things in the past where the work wasn't done on the ground, but we got to clean up the mess afterwards. And so I think you'll find he has a great perspective from many ways, both law enforcement and county management on these issues, and I appreciate you letting me introduce him and his ability to testify.
Thank you very much, Mr. Walden. I look forward to Mr. Swift's testimony. We'll start with, on my left side and move down. So, Mr. Bozeman, you are recognized for 5 minutes. And if you would press the on button on the microphone, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am Joel Bozeman, chairman of the Sublette County, Wyoming Commission, and I am also president of the Wyoming County Commissioners Association. I am opposed to Secretarial Order 3310, and I ask Secretary Salazar to withdraw the order. I request that my written testimony and attachments be submitted for the record. On January 18, 2011, President Obama signed an executive order stating that our regulatory system must protect the environment while promoting economic growth and job creation. Only a month earlier, Secretary Ken Salazar signed Secretarial Order 3310, which will have the opposite effect. This order will eliminate jobs and wreak havoc with the western states' economies. The legal authority to establish wilderness study areas ended many years ago. The new implementation documents for the Secretarial Order say that lands with wilderness characteristics will be managed under the same legal criteria as the original wilderness study area. It is clear that BLM is attempting an end run on congressional authority by simply changing the name to wildlands. At some point, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it is a duck, even if the Secretary chooses to call it a chicken. Now let me give an example of the real impact Secretarial Order 3310 would have on one specific RMP area in Wyoming. The BLM incorrectly identified 20% of this area as having wildland wilderness characteristics. In this area, BLM identified 56 land with wilderness characteristics, LWCs, comprising 571,000 acres. Just within this area, there are over 600 miles of roads, more than 400 reservoirs, 300 miles of fence, 154 range improvements, 10 miles of water pipeline, 17 water wells, 68 miles of oil and gas pipeline, 8 active oil and gas wells, 59 plugged and abandoned wells, and almost 250,000 acres under active oil and gas lease. Does this sound like wildlands to you? The identification of all these structures and improvements is not an exercise in discretion. They are there, and the term wildlands is not appropriate. If BLM chooses to designate this small portion of Wyoming as wildlands, what would be the impact on jobs and the economy? Understand that BLM is required to protect potential LWCs during the planning process so as to not lose the option of designating them in the final plan. Using the same economic model used by BLM in its planning efforts, these LWCs would generate 258 drilling jobs, up to 614 production jobs by 2025. This would equate to almost $14 million in labor income per year during the drilling phase and over $51 million in the production phase per year. Using the same percentage as an example of LWCs throughout BLM in Wyoming, the potential revenue to Wyoming would be nearly $12 billion. That's billion, not million. And the local, state, and federal tax revenue would be about $3 billion over 20 years. We cannot afford this loss to our state. Livestock grazing in the proposed LWCs will be impacted. Grazing may still be allowed, but grazing management practices and the ability of permittees to maintain and install improvements necessary for livestock distribution will be severely restricted. Predator control efforts will be restricted, resulting in more loss to both livestock and wildlife. Using this same BLM area and economic model as earlier described, grazing AUMs within LWCs have an economic value to local communities of about $27 million in livestock production, over $12 million in employment earnings, and 380 annual jobs. Again, this is only one small area of Wyoming. We do not live in Wyoming to go to the opera. We live in Wyoming because we love to ranch, hunt, fish, hike, camp, ride our four-wheelers and our snowmobiles. Some of us want true wilderness, and we have an abundance of that as well. This is our custom and our culture, our way of life, our way of making a living. Secretarial Order 3310 should be rescinded. It is not supported by a law. It amounts to de facto creation of wilderness. It is contrary to thoughtful public policy, and implementation of this order will result in negative economic impact and loss of jobs in all our western states. We can and must do better. Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Chairman. I'd be glad to answer questions.
Commissioner Bausman, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Commissioner McKee, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Again, I'm Mike McKee, County Commissioner of Uintah County, Utah. I represent the Utah Association of Counties. I also co-chair the Western Homestead Legacy Alliance, representing counties and multiple user groups from across the West who are deeply concerned about Executive Order 3310, the Wildlands Policy. In Uintah County, only 15% of our land mass is privately owned. This fact underscores the importance of having sound policy and procedure on our public lands. Policy changes during the past 2 years have had a chilling effect on the economy of our county. Many of our citizens have had to leave and relocate, hoping that the jobs will return, and many times leaving family members behind. The combination of regressive gas leasing policies and the new wildlands policy will result in even further job loss and negative impact to our area. Several years ago, the BLM was processing 1,000 to 1,300 permits to drill per year. Recently, State Director of the BLM in the state of Utah told us that they anticipated to process 100 permits for the coming year. We are deeply alarmed. Our community is suffering, and this suffering can be directly tied to the policies of the Department of Interior. In Uintah County, this comes from a University of Utah study, 50% of our jobs, 60% of our economy is directly tied to the extractive industry. Our county's surveyor recently told us that he had 6 survey crews. Today he has 1. I recently visited with a CEO who has a business with a cutting-edge technology in the natural gas industry, yet he can see the handwriting on the wall. 1 year ago, 40% of his business was local. Today it is just 5%. He will likely move his headquarters, having just returned from Dubai, as an option. Why would a business owner even consider such an option with all the unrest in the Middle East? What is wrong with this picture? Is the business environment better in the Middle East than on our own public lands? There are numerous problems with this new order. The proposed wildlands designations do not meet the actual definitions of wilderness, but are being managed as wilderness, even with dirt roads, livestock development, drilling rigs, pipelines, transmission lines. I had pictures that I was going to present that would roll through as we were doing this today, but apparently the system's down, but I would like to present that as part of the record.
They will be part of the record.
Okay, thank you. Let me be more specific. Over the last close to a decade, starting in 2001, BLM began a revision of the resource management plans for Utah and the Uintah Basin where I live. This process was governed by NEPA, was open to the public, and Uintah County participated as a cooperating agency. Thousands of hours was spent. Well over $1 million of our county funds, if you include the time, was put into this. Many other entities, including environmental groups, participated to bring to fruition a management plan that takes a comprehensive look at all the public land uses in Uintah County, though. Although long, sometimes painful, and playing to no one group as a favorite, the process worked according to the law. Concessions were made on all sides, and nobody got everything that they wanted. There's more, though. Towards the end of the Vernal RMP, an additional process was added, which was called Alternative E. This took an additional 2 years, and the idea here was to look at wilderness quality, to do the full evaluation of wilderness quality issues. 2 years were added to that process, and that became part of the decision, part of the ROD, the Record of Decision in the RMP. The Wildlands Policy also directly repudiates the Utah Wilderness Settlement Agreement of 2003. In 2003, the Wilderness Settlement Agreement essentially said, I'm having to hurry here, but essentially outside of these Section 603 wilderness study areas, these lands were not to be managed as wilderness, although they may become wilderness. Obviously, with this order, you can see that has been turned upside down. Let me just mention real quickly, Mr. Chairman, Utah is a treasure chest of natural resource. Uintah County has a great opportunity to help America become energy independent. Utah has 6.7 trillion cubic feet of proven natural gas reserves, conventional oil reserves of 286 million barrels. We also have, according to the RAND report, a staggering 56 billion to 321 billion barrels of reserves there as well. Companies are ready to invest large sums of money in our county. All told, these investments could exceed well over $15 billion over a 10-year period. However, the regulatory uncertainty and the adverse policies, and this is in my area, this $15 billion, the regulatory uncertainty and the adverse policies of the Department of Interior is preventing these companies from investing and may drive the investments overseas. Once this investment is gone, it is very difficult to bring it back. Our natural resources should be responsibly developed pursuant to the laws of the land. We have the responsibility to carefully develop our resources for America, for energy security, for our economy, for jobs, and for our citizens. The role of Congress is clear in the terms of wilderness policy, and I urge this Congress to preserve its authority and reverse this policy to save my county and our country from further economic harm. We urge this committee to take every possible action to repeal the wildlands policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Commissioner Robinson, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Hastings and members of the committee. I appreciate you letting me testify today. I'm Leslie Robinson. I'm the chairman of the Montana Association of Counties Public Lands Committee and a commissioner from Phillips County. I also serve as the chairman of the National Association of Counties Federal Land Management Subcommittee and serve on the NACO Western Interstate Region Board. Phillips County spans 5,213 square miles. We have approximately 4,000 people, but 51,000 cattle in our county. 98% of Phillips County's 3.2 million acres is classified as agriculture land. Approximately 1.1 million acres of that is BLM, and 1.5 million is private land. Phillips County's economy is dependent on agriculture and natural gas production. 2008 Montana agriculture statistics state that cash sales of agriculture commodities for Phillips County was $87 million, and that's excluding government payments. These raw agriculture commodities are further processed and transported to other regions of the U.S. and the world, generating $434 million in commerce. That's just from our county. Based on annual consumption levels, Phillips County produces enough beef to feed 280,000 people and enough wheat to feed 1.4 million people. 4 of the top 15 taxpayers in Phillips County are natural gas companies. The direct employment from gas production in Phillips County results in 100 full-time jobs. The natural gas produced in Phillips County results, it is enough gas to heat 48,000 homes. The active management of public lands is essential to the economy of our community. We strongly oppose federal land management agency actions that limit access and multiple use of lands that would be available to the public. As the economy continues to recover, access to public lands is necessary to provide food and fuel to the American people. Phillips County is in the heart of the 2.5 million acres referred to in the Department of Interior's leaked memo as possible national monument designation under the Antiquities Act. We are referred to as some of the largest unplowed areas of grassland in the world and some of the best wildlife habitat regions in the Great Plains. I'm a 4th-generation Phillips County rancher, and the people of Phillips County have protected these lands and the wildlife for over 100 years. We found a way to stimulate the economy in our community. We invited BLM Director Robert Abbey, the author of the leaked memo, to Malta to hear our concerns. The local gymnasium had close to 2,000 people from all over the state of Montana there to listen and voice their concerns. And even though the land that was referred to in the leaked memo only affected 2 counties, there were people from all over the state of Montana that understood the impacts to everyone if this land was designated as a monument, and I could put in or wildland. We support the National Monument Designation Transparency and Accountability Act, which recognizes the role of local county governments in the designation of national monuments and ensures review by local elected officials. Last November, I was invited to participate in the BLM's National Landscape Conservation System Summit. We spent 2 days, is mostly BLM people and others, but we spent 2 days discussing the BLM's land management with no discussion of wildlands. And only 1 month later, Secretary Salazar and Director Abbey announced the Wildlands Directive. Special designations such as wildlands will create more restrictions on the land, and even if we lose 1 family from the county due to increased restrictions, it'll have a noticeable negative impact to our economy. I have real concern with the growing trend of the current administration toward land designations developed in DC. Local economies suffer from top-down land use decisions. Only Congress has the authority to designate land as wilderness, but yet wildlands is a designation not subject to congressional approval and undermines the established process for land use planning. The first stop should be at the local level, and I'm not referring to the local BLM office. Counties should be fully involved in the drafting and the development of any proposal impacting lands within the county's jurisdiction. There's a push to substantially increase funding for federal land acquisitions. Phillips County has over 1 million acres of BLM land that we receive PILT payments for. These payments don't fully replace tax revenues collected by private landowners. Increased ownership of land by federal government would put a burden on the county and the country. In conclusion, I would like to reiterate that any decisions to change uses on public lands impacts local economies and the economy of the United States. And thank you again for giving me the opportunity to testify.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Robinson, for your testimony. Commissioner Smith, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Hastings and Congressmen of the committee. I am a commissioner in Jackson County in southwest Oregon. I am here to oppose Secretarial Order 3310 and express extreme disappointment concerning the federal government's failed forest management. The federal government owns more than half of Oregon, so federal land policies have a profound effect on my state. 52% of Jackson County are federal lands. In my county lie a national monument, a national park, 3 national forests, and the BLM Medford District Office. These federal lands once supported a thriving timber and wood products industry. Not anymore. Federal policies have pulled the rug out from underneath us in southwestern Oregon. Jackson County once had 35 lumber mills employing thousands of men and women, but the last of these mills closed within the last 2 years. This tremendous loss is largely due to the federal decision to prevent timber harvest to save forests from even the most sustainable timber harvest practices. As a result, my county routinely has unemployment rates 50% higher than the national average, as do the surrounding counties. Secretarial Order 3310 promises to make the situation worse by locking up even more BLM land, creating de facto wilderness areas without congressional action or oversight and without local support. Order 3310 will not only prevent consideration of normal forestry, it will eliminate recreational uses such as snowmobiling, trail biking, motorcycling, and other motorized access. The elderly and the handicapped will be shut out as well. More withdrawn land means more economic misery. Sadly, experts agree that abandoning management is resulting in forests that are unhealthy, insect-ridden, and increasingly prone to catastrophic wildfires. Order 3310 should be reversed in its entirety, or at a minimum, BLM lands in Western Oregon should be exempted. The Department of Interior solicitor has already concluded that most of the BLM lands in Western Oregon are not legally eligible for wilderness consideration. Order 3310 overlooks that solicitor's opinion, and I ask this committee to remind Secretary Salazar of his legal obligations. Let me explain. The BLM manages about 2.1 million acres in scattered small parcels in 18 counties in Western Oregon. Those lands are governed by a unique statute, the ONC Act, applicable nowhere else. The unusual history of the lands, which were once in private ownership, is described in more detail in my written testimony before you. The ONC Act requires that all ONC lands suitable for growing timber must be managed for that purpose, and the timber sold, cut, and removed in conformity with the principles of sustained yield. The ONC Act requires 50% of the revenues generated from timber sales be paid to the 18 ONC counties. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has stated that the ONC Act is a dominant use statute, giving timber production priority over all other possible uses. The ONC lands are not governed by FLTMA's Multiple Use Directive. Section 701B of FLTMA specifically recognizes the dominance of the ONC Act's mandate and defers to it. Virtually all of the ONC lands are capable of growing timber and therefore must be used for sustained yield timber production and should be exempted. There are those that will try to tell you that economic benefits of land withdrawals outweigh the benefits of developed economic activity. First, show us the money. How are counties going to pay for sheriff's patrols, search and rescue, and provide the expected services for the users of public lands? Second, how do we replace the family wage jobs with seasonal, low-wage employment in tourist-related businesses? We already have millions of acres of lands in Western Oregon reserved from timber harvests. Locking up more lands under Order 3310 will produce no tourist industry benefits. If the ONC lands are now to be used for ecosystem services instead of timber production, it will be necessary to value those non-consumptive uses and compensate the counties accordingly. I'm here to ask you to bring rationality back to the federal forest management. The current legal structure is badly snarled, a Gordian knot. And those of us who live in forested communities are desperate for some sign that the federal government can be a capable land manager. Rolling back Order 3310 should be a meaningful first step. In closing, Mr. Salazar, take down this order.
To quote a famous phrase, I should say. Thank you very much, Commissioner. Mr. Myers, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Hastings and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and it's good to see Congressman Labrador from my home state of Idaho. Good to see you again, Congressman. I'm going to avoid the temptation to read excerpts of my written statement and try to talk a little bit more extemporaneously. That necessarily means I'll be less eloquent than my predecessors on the panel, but it may also mean that I'll take less time, which I suspect you would appreciate. But with an exception that I will read a couple of quotes. The first quote I want to read is from the Supreme Court decision in 2004, Norton v. Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, in which the unanimous Supreme Court said, multiple use management is a deceptively simple term that describes the enormously complicated task of striking a balance among the many competing uses to which land can be put. The question for this committee is whether the wildlands policy announced by the Secretary is an appropriate balance, well struck by this department. You've heard already today from those who think that the answer to that question is no. I'll provide you with some insights on the legal issues, which tend to be more mundane, perhaps less interesting than the policy considerations, but nonetheless something I hope you are interested in. Of course, the basis for the BLM's action in this administration and previously is the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, which calls primarily for multiple use and sustained yield. I've had an opportunity to read the BLM's new manuals that were issued last Friday, although with some haste because I was preparing to come here and traveling, so I've not had a chance to read them word for word. But from what I've read, I'd like to comment on a few passages. Manual 6301 is the duty to inventory. I'd like to dispatch with one misconception that I think is swirling in this discussion. The duty to inventory is not new with Secretary Salazar. It was not new with Secretary Norton. The Norton-Leavitt agreement specifically disclaimed any undoing of the duty to inventory. In other words, it maintained that duty. Senator D. Benson, federal district judge in Utah, reviewed the Norton-Leavitt settlement because it was challenged by some environmental groups. In ruling on that challenge, Judge Benson said that the Norton-Leavitt agreement preserved the duty to inventory. The 10th Circuit, in reviewing Judge Benson's decision and upholding it, likewise said the department has an ongoing duty to inventory public lands for all the multiple uses and resources that exist there. The 9th Circuit has said the same thing. So I think we can put aside for the moment, and perhaps for a while, the question of whether the department has an ongoing duty to inventory the public lands. It does. That's not the question. The question here is whether the inventorying of one of those values or resources, namely wilderness, perhaps to the exclusion of others, is the proper balance. Now, Secretary Salazar, to be fair, did not disclaim the duty to inventory for other resources. But the fact that he was silent on all other resources and focused his efforts and the energy only on one naturally gives rise to questions as to whether he understands the co-equal duty of the BLM to inventory for all BLM resources and values. Manual 6302 deals with RMP production and basically says that an RMP can be created and should be created to sustain wildlands if wilderness characteristics exist. In Secretary Salazar's order and in the manuals, there's no statement that says that that designation can be undone in the future by an amendment to a resource management plan. Of course, it can be undone because that's what FLTMA says. And in reading Director Abbey's testimony, I was pleased to see that he said as much. These designations can be changed. But the fact that the Secretary's order did not say so, again, has given rise to concern and skepticism. The question of wilderness characteristics is crucial. What are they? Well, size is one of them, but not really, because it starts out with 5,000 acres or more, but then it's really less than 5,000 acres if you can manage it practicably for less amount of acreage. And then it's even less than that, it's islands of public land. I don't know the definition of that phrase. Outstanding opportunities for solitude. Those can be cabined into one portion of an area with wilderness characteristics and do not have to apply to the entire area. Primitive and unconfined recreation exists, not really, because under the order you can include ATV use and mountain biking, so that one seems to be out of the way. The only criterion that's left is naturalness, and there it's the apparent naturalness in the view of the, quote, average visitor. I don't know where the mythical average visitor lives. I suspect that visitor would have a different view if they were from the District of Columbia as if they were from Ada County, but that's nonetheless where we are. So the three criteria used in the Wilderness Act seem to be whittled away and dissolved to a certain extent by the order. There are concerns about what the Secretary will do in managing these lands which he deems as chiefly valuable for wilderness in the light of the Taylor Grazing Act, which sets up grazing districts, which the Secretary has to designate and establishes those grazing districts as chiefly valuable for grazing. The 10th Circuit said, quote, Congress intended that once the Secretary established a grazing district under the Taylor Grazing Act, the primary use of that land should be grazing, close quote. So I don't know how the Secretary is going to balance the designation of an area that's already chiefly valuable for grazing is now chiefly valuable for wilderness. It's silent in the order, again, giving rise to concerns. There are other concerns that arise in the context of the APA and whether the process really is a regulation or rulemaking that requires APA compliance with public notice and comment. There are also concerns or issues related to NEPA. Why didn't this order go through a programmatic EIS like the wind energy order of the Secretary and the geothermal program of the Secretary? Both of those actually dealt with less BLM acres than this order does, and yet those both were able to go through the public process of a programmatic EIS. The failure to apply it in this case could lead to some questions.
The gentleman's full statement is in the record, and I appreciate that.
I appreciate your time, Mr. Chairman.
Good. Thank you very much, Mr. Myers. Mr. Metcalf, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity. I am Peter Metcalf, CEO and founder of Black Diamond Equipment, a publicly traded company, and Vice Chair of the Outdoor Industry Association of America. I am here in support of Secretarial Order 3310, requiring the inventory of BLM lands. I'm concerned this policy is being framed as a jobs killer initiative. On the contrary, I connect the inventory and protection of wilderness characteristics to 3 core points. 1, job creation and sustainable economies across the American West. 2, adherence to multiple use principles on BLM lands. And thirdly, the balanced use of the natural and economic resources these lands provide. With $125 million a year in revenue and a NASDAQ listing, Black Diamond manufactures and globally distributes human-powered outdoor recreation equipment. We employ over 475 employees worldwide and 250 at our Salt Lake City headquarters. We began in the late 1980s with a commitment to create innovative gear and to champion the access to and preservation of backcountry environments where our customers go to recreate. In this month's issue of the Harvard Business Review, Michael Porter's cover piece is entitled, quote, How to Fix Capitalism and Unleash a New Wave of Growth. And I quote, companies must take the lead in bringing business and society back together. They must reconnect company success with social progress and not from a philanthropic way. They must recognize that optimizing short-term financial gain while overlooking the needs of their customers and the depletion of natural resources vital to their business is not sustainable, end quote. The outdoor recreation industry is dependent upon healthy, diverse public lands. The American people need quality places to play, to hunt, to fish, including well-managed backcountry, wild lands, and wilderness. These lands and waters in their natural state have economic value. Together, we can replace the jobs versus conservation debate with a jobs versus jobs discussion, one that recognizes, first, the vast natural and economic resources of our public lands, and second, the spectrum of jobs that build and sustain communities. For too long, the active outdoor industry's economic clout has been overlooked. Annually, active outdoor recreation contributes over $730 billion to our country's economy, generates $88 billion in taxes, and supports 6.5 million American jobs. This isn't pocket change. Americans spend $46 billion each year on active outdoor gear, apparel, and services. Additionally, they spend approximately $243 billion on active outdoor excursions, totaling $289 million in direct expenditures. The $441 billion in indirect expenditures are a result of a ripple effect. Hunters and anglers are an important segment of our industry. Over 13 million Americans hunt and 33 million fish. This supports over 900,000 jobs and over $6 billion in taxes. Sportsmen are dependent on public lands. In the wild, backcountry, fish and wildlife can thrive. The conservation of these areas is vital to the economic future of hunting and fishing. Our industry hosts outdoor retailer trade shows in Salt Lake City. These 2 annual shows bring over 2,000 companies, 40,000 people, and $40 million in direct spending to the city. Yet in the summer of 2003, when then Governor Leavitt walked the show with me in the sold-out Soap Palace, he commented, quote, "I had no idea that such an industry existed." Well, we do exist, and we do need to be heard. We ask that the natural landscapes we depend upon for the success of our businesses are sustained. Order 3310 properly places preservation and stewardship of outdoor recreation venues on equal footing with other uses of public lands. It puts our industry, with its need for the protection of wilderness characteristics, back in the multiple use mix, along with other important economic drivers like oil and gas, mining, and coal. Order 3310 is not about designating wilderness. Only Congress has that authority. The policy will inventory and provide them with current data and will require that wilderness quality to be considered in planning appropriate uses of federal lands. If wilderness qualities are altered now, the American people may lose options and resources. In our quest to create a vital society, we learn that zoning communities keeps them vibrant. In zoning for manufacturing, commercial, residential, we understand that a vibrant community needs these facets in specific areas. The same is true for our public lands. They are lands of multiple use, but a civilized and vibrant culture understands that you achieve that through thoughtful zoning and not by allowing all uses of all lands. There is room for all of us. Utah has 22.9 million acres of BLM lands, only 260,000 are designated wilderness, and 3.2 million are wilderness study areas. 5 million acres are under lease to the oil and gas industry. Only 1 million of these leased lands are actually under production. For generations, our public lands have helped define us as a people, and they provide a platform for one of America's most vibrant and sustainable economic sectors, the outdoor industry. Well-known futurist Stuart Brand stated, and I quote, "Natural systems are priceless in value and nearly impossible to replace, but they are cheap to maintain. All you have to do is to defend them." BLM's policy will do just that, restore a balanced and economically smart approach to the management of our uniquely American natural landscapes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Metcalf. And Mr. Scalacci, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to be brief. I know that it's getting late and that we still have one more witness and one more panel. My name is Mark Scalacci. I'm a professor of law and the director of the Natural Resources Law Center at the University of Colorado Law School. It's my pleasure to appear before the committee today in support of Secretarial Order 3310, which promotes the protection of wilderness characteristics for lands managed by the BLM. I offer this support because I believe that this order is grounded in the law and is good policy, and I'd like to briefly explain why. As I said, I'm going to depart from my prepared remarks, and I want to talk about 2 issues that appear to be of major concern to the committee. They are the question of whether or not the Secretarial Order effectively allows the designation of de facto wilderness, and secondly, whether the process that the Secretary used in promulgating this order was appropriate. So first, let me turn to this question about whether or not the order somehow leads to de facto wilderness. I don't think you can say that it does, and I say this because under the Secretarial Order, we're simply going to be following the land use planning process that's outlined in FLPMA. Wilderness, as we've heard many times today, is designated by Congress. Now, land use designations are, of course, designated by the agency, in this case the BLM, and those decisions are, to some extent, ephemeral. They can be changed by the agency once they follow the land use planning process. Indeed, under the order, the initial decision to determine that land is wildland is not required, even if that land has wilderness characteristics. I hope that we can all agree that lands that have wilderness characteristics do have some special value for that purpose. So the question becomes, how do we deal with lands that may have those wilderness characteristics? And I think in this situation, the Secretarial Order does a very good job. As we've talked about today, and as Mr. Myers just noted in his testimony, the first step in the process is to inventory the lands and to identify the lands that have wilderness characteristics. I'd point out that that specific requirement, that is to inventory the lands with wilderness characteristics, was specifically required by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in the case Oregon Natural Desert Association versus the BLM in August of last year. But then there's a second step, of course, and that is the decision as to whether or not to designate the lands as wildlands. And as I noted, that decision is discretionary. I want to just read briefly from the language in the Secretarial Order. And this is from Section 4, which is entitled Policy. This is really the heart of the Secretarial Order. It states that all BLM offices shall protect these inventoried wilderness characteristics when undertaking land use planning, unless the BLM determines that impairment of wilderness characteristics is appropriate. Note that the language is imbued with the discretion on the part of the agency, and this decision as to whether or not designating these lands as wild lands, whether that's appropriate, is going to be done through the public land use planning process. So I think what you'd have to conclude from this is that what the BLM has done with this order is simply good policy. They identify what they have, they inventory what they have, and then they make a considered judgment as to whether or not it makes sense to protect the wildlands that are there. Let me turn briefly to the issue of process. There are, I think, two aspects to this process issue, one policy and one legal. I want to touch briefly on both of them. The policy question, I suppose, basically is whether or not this was unfair, whether or not the states and the parties who were affected by the policy somehow had no understanding that this might, in fact, be the way that BLM lands would be governed. I would point out, as I noted in my written testimony, that the policy embodied in the Secretarial Order is a policy that goes back literally to the time that FLPMA was passed in 1976. And every administration since that time, until 2003, in the second Bush administration, followed this policy. I included in my testimony a legal opinion that was written by the Solicitor's Office to the director of the BLM during the Reagan administration, pointing out that Section 202, the land use planning provisions of FLPMA, specifically allow the designation or the recognition of wilderness characteristics of land under that process, even if those lands weren't protected under the wilderness study area provision of FLPMA, that is Section 603. So this is something that has been around for a long time. The change that really occurred was in 2003 in the private out-of-court settlement that I believe is not enforceable. I want to talk briefly about the legal issue as well, because there's a question about whether or not the agency should have followed a notice and comment process as might be required by the APA. I see I'm out of time. I think I'll just wrap up briefly by noting that, that the process that was used here was adequate under the law, that it did not really change the law in any significant way. It was always there. There was no process used during the previous administrations that followed this policy, and so it seems appropriate to recognize that this policy should be upheld and should be endorsed by this committee. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Squalchi. I appreciate very much, and I appreciate all of you for your testimony. We'll now begin with a round of questioning. Each member will have 5 minutes, and I'll begin with myself. And I have a question for Solicitor Myers. We've seen that there's a lot of discussion from a lot of different people on the process, so let me try to be as specific here as I can. In justifying the wildlands order, the administration cites Section 102, 201, and 603 of the Federal Land Policy and Management Act to argue that they are compelled to impose this wildlands order. Do these sections compel this order?
Mr. Chairman, I think I need to answer your question in two parts. The first part is I think that Section 603 of FLTMA, which has set up a 15-year window in which the BLM would conduct its initial inventory for wilderness, is really separate and apart from today's issue. Today's issue is the question of whether Section 201 and 202 give the agency the authority for what it does. Secretary Salazar himself has said that he's not relying on Section 603 and that he doesn't believe that his policy is undoing the Norton-Levitt settlement. I will take him at his word. But the question that you arise is whether these give the authority. My understanding from, again, reading the testimony of the BLM and others is that they thought that the duty to do this was compelled not by these sections of FLTMA, but by the fact that the BLM was without a current wilderness inventory handbook. And so that because they had no existing authority that was clearly distributed to all of the BLM staff westwide, they had to undertake this effort to create one. And that's what the 3 manuals are that they've published. So I don't see it as a question of statutory compulsion. I see it as a question of the BLM deciding they needed to put out some direction, or they wanted to put out some direction to their staff, and this is how they did it.
So they're not compelled by the Wilderness Act, and in your view, by your testimony, to do this?
No, sir, I don't think so. Judge Benson, when he reviewed the Norton-Levitt settlement, said that the settlement was legal under both NEPA and FLTMA.
Okay, and so NEPA is out too from nothing in NEPA compels this then?
Well, at least according to that federal district court judge,
Right.
who's the one who looked most specific.
Well, then let's get right down to that. Is there any court order that compels this to happen for this order?
Not that I know of.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. I will end mine and we'll go. Mr. Holt is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the witnesses. Mr. Metcalf, much of the call from the other witnesses for jobs seems to focus on extraction industry type jobs. You seem to be saying that that there's job creation from conservation, it's not a jobs versus conservation approach. How would you characterize kind of short-term, mid-term, and long-term the job prospects?
For the active outdoor industries that we're
Yes,
referring to?
yes.
Very promising, so long as we work to maintain the integrity and health and vibrancy of our public lands, of which we include wilderness within that. The outdoor industry in America was one of the industries least impacted by the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, rebounded more quickly than any other industry, continues to grow and employ people. And if you just look at visitation in places like Utah to national parks in 2010, it was at just about an all-time high.
And mid-term and longer term?
So long as we work to maintain the integrity of the lands that this industry is predicated upon, the prospects are very good. It's a great competitive advantage this industry has. This industry is the global leader in part because our brands are dependent upon these iconic landscapes we have here in the West. They're a magnetic draw to people from all over the world. You can't copy these in Bangladesh, and you can't do them more cheaply in China. People come here for these amazing landscapes. And, that's probably the reason why we have on the Utah license plate delicate arch and not an oil drilling rig.
No, I hope there's time to pursue that further, because it's curious to me that the other witnesses aren't saying that. And, I'm genuinely trying to figure out why, because for so many of us, that's what Utah is. That's what Idaho is. That's what, anyway. So, Professor Squilles, let me make sure that we state it clearly and simply. Your view is that Secretary Norton's interpretation was an aberration, that it was a departure from what had existed for, well, decades before, and that what is before us now is a return to or a restoration of what existed before. Is that a clear statement?
That's
and
correct.
accurate?
And I would just add one brief point about that, which is that the issue of whether or not it was lawful, Secretary Norton's settlement was lawful, was never tested in the courts, because once the settlement went through and it was basically challenged in the courts, it was not the plaintiffs were deemed not to have standing to pursue the issue further, and so it never really came up on the merits.
Now, several have, you also spoke about the consistency with the previous law. Several of the witnesses have suggested or even stated that this usurps congressional authority regarding wilderness designations. Do you think that there's anything inconsistent with congressional intent or congressional prerogative?
I would say there's clearly nothing inconsistent with the Wilderness Act or any other legislation that I'm familiar with in this order. I mean, you can go back to well before the Wilderness Act and see how the agency has protected lands as primitive areas and as other kind of protected classes of lands, and it's continued to happen since FLTMA was enacted, since the Wilderness Act was enacted. You know, there are over 100 wilderness study areas that have been designated under Section 202 of FLTMA already. So we already have a long-standing record, history, practice of designating these sort of protected lands for a host of good reasons that aren't part of the sort of classic wilderness study area provision in Section 603 of FLTMA. So I think the record's clear on that.
Okay, thank you. And which interpretation, let's for simplicity call them the Norton interpretation or Salazar interpretation, is more consistent with the anticipated role of the public participation in the designation?
Well, again, I want to emphasize here that all we're doing is putting this issue of whether we should protect lands with wilderness characteristics on the table. And if people disagree with that decision, if they think that there are better uses for the lands that have wilderness characteristics, then the public participation is allowed to work around that and help the agency in making the best decision that they can make. So I think absolutely keeping this question on the table of this important resource that we know by definition is a diminishing resource. They're not making lands with wilderness characteristics anymore. So we really ought to be focused on this as part of the public process. If the judgment is we shouldn't protect these roadless wilderness characteristics lands, then the agency is free to make that decision, but only after they've made this through a considered process.
Thank you. I thank the witnesses. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd first like to unanimous consent in or statement into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Boy, I tell you, growing up in Colorado, my father retired from the Army, and he was engaged in outdoor, my family made a living from outdoor recreation. And so what I love about having part of your economy, a significant part of your economy that's engaged in outdoor tourism is it forces you to maintain the environment. But at the same time, I got to tell you, I've got a concern. And my concern, I guess, is having my own military career, having spent 5 assignments outside the United States, 4 of which took me to the Middle East, and understanding the instability of that region and the fact that whether we like it or not, America probably very likely may have an energy crisis that may cause a double-dip recession in this very fragile economic recovery. And so the question is where is the balance? I mean, where is the balance? And it does seem to me that we are not in balance, and that Americans ought to be able to responsibly develop American energy. And we don't seem to be able to do that. And I guess my question about this, the Wildlands Order, is, and from the commissioners and also from anybody that wants to answer this, will this hurt oil and gas development in the United States at a time when families in my district who are already hurting, and we got gas at the pump going north of $3 a gallon. And I think we're going to see it go north of $4 a gallon, and I think it's going to stay there for a while. And so I'd like anybody to comment on that who would like to. Commissioner? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. In my county, we have the Western Energy Alliance, which is a group of small producers. They've done a survey among their members, and they have shown that there's about $1.8 billion of investment that has left over the last 2 years because of policies that we've had over the past 2 years, and that investment that has already left. We're very concerned with this new wildlands policy because what we see happening from here. And in the directive that was just sent out 2 or 3 days ago, it talks about that if there's any project that's going to be moving forward outside of emergency provision, that it will be measured. It needs to go to the Washington office for review. So this is taking out the local field manager. It's taking out the state office. Everything has to come here to Washington. There will be further delays and also the opportunity to say no. And we've already seen this in our area where these projects and other issues come to Washington and gets buried.
Yes, Commissioner.
Yes, Congressman and Mr. Chairman. I'd like to give an example in my county in Wyoming. Many of you may have heard of the Jonah Field. It is considered about the 3rd largest gas field in the nation. The Jonah Field has about 2 to 4 more years of level production, and it's going to start tapering off. In order to continue the flow of gas and the production of gas to the country, that company in Kenna has instigated the start of another planning process close to the existing Jonah Field. In other words, they need to expand. Part of that expansion is NEPA with BLM. Our county is a cooperating agency with BLM in that process. The problem, as I see it, with now that we've introduced the wildlands discussion, part of that NEPA process in designating even potential wildlands as we amend the RMPs, that will preclude, will likely forestall that planning process for energy development until such time as a decision is made, should this be wildlands or should it not be wildlands? And that decision can take anywhere from 3 to 5 years. The planning process for an energy development process, another separate EIS, environmental impact statement, could take some of these that we've been participating in have been taking 5 to 7 years to get through the process. The red tape, the bureaucratic process is so cumbersome, and this is adding another layer onto that, and we're very concerned that gas flow could very likely stop under this scenario, and huge impact on the economy.
Thank you very much.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentlelady from Hawaii, Ms. Hanabuso.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My question is for, I'm sorry, Professor, how do you pronounce your name? Scalacci?
Yes.
Okay. It's for Professor Scalacci. Professor, in reading both your statements as well as the statement by Mr. Myers there, one of the things that if you would just bear with me and walk me through this, it seems to me that the first misperception we had even from this morning's testimony, that somehow the inventory in and of itself would then determine wilderness, that somehow if you get classified as this wilderness characteristic, that will then make you a de facto wilderness area. Is that correct? Is that our misperception in what we're seeing here?
Yes, I think it's clear that under the policy, the inventory is just that. It's just a judgment about what kinds of resources exist, wild lands or not, but it's not a judgment as to whether or not they will be protected in that way.
And what was interesting to me is the reference to the word characteristic that everyone seems to be glossing over. So then the next question is, because there's references, and I think it was your letter to the Secretary, which was signed on by 50 some odd other professors,
right.
There was a discussion of the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act, which then leads me to believe that somewhere in that persons who may have an interest, whether there be in natural gas or whatever else, that may somehow have leases that may become then affected, I would assume that there would be some kind of a contested case process or administrative proceeding, which they then could avail themselves if they disagree with that. Am I wrong? I noticed that the rules just came out.
I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, I was hoping to get to that, and I didn't have time in my opening testimony, but the point is that in making a decision on land use planning for an individual district of the BLM, there will be a full public process, and so if the judgment is made or if there is a proposal made to protect or not protect certain parts of that district as wildlands, that will be open for full discussion with the public and debate, and presumably a decision will then be made that would be fully appealable by somebody who objected. So there's a full public process with that decision.
And I assume that whenever anyone is using federal lands, that there is probably a lease in place, so they would have some sort of a vested right of some sort, but it doesn't give one an inherent right into the future to the use of all public lands. So that would also be something that I would assume would also be calculated into this process. Would that be correct?
That's exactly right. Typically, we protect what we call valid existing rights. And so if someone had a valid existing right within one of these areas, presumably it would be protected or perhaps grandfathered in the process in a way that would assure that those rights were not unduly trampled on.
So would it be correct to say, what it seems to me is that the Norton case kind of sent a whole bunch of things kind of off track. So this is an attempt to put it back into a process. It looks like the fundamental choices that we're discussing here is really a process to preserve lands into the future, which may or may not be used for different purposes now. But if it's affected by this characteristic, whatever that characteristic may become, whoever is affected or an injured party at that point will have the opportunity to contest it and to make their case. Would that be a correct statement?
I think that's correct. It arguably is not even that strong. So it's not necessarily a process to preserve lands, but a process to preserve options. A choice can be made about whether or not you want to preserve lands in the process.
And just so that we're clear, in the process of a designation and the inventory, they would have the opportunity to challenge even that inventory in that characteristic category of wilderness.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady. Gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Tipton, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, panel, for being here. I have a couple of questions, and I think I'd like to start first maybe with our county commissioners. You deal with this on a very intimate basis. I come out of Colorado, and we currently have 20 million, in my district, 20 million acres of federal land. 20 million, 7.2 million of that happens to be BLM land. I've had extensive interaction through my office and then living there. Has the BLM in your districts, have they ever requested any land to be taken out of a study area that you're aware of?
If I might, in 1991, and this again is in my county, this is in an area that's known as the Winter Ridge area.
Mm-hmm.
That area was recommended by Secretary Lujan at the time not to be a wilderness study area. However, that continues to be on the books today as a wilderness study area.
Since 1991?
Since 1991, yes.
Any other?
That's the one that I'm familiar with because it's
Okay.
in my county.
Great.
Yeah.
Any others? Okay, that's interesting. We've talked about full public process a lot. How many of you had public meetings when it came to wildlands that were held prior to this designation?
We had a series of public meetings, but it was over the Siskiyou Monument designation under Secretary Babbitt.
So nothing over wildlands?
Nothing over wildlands.
That just came into being. And Professor, I had kind of a question. This was based a little bit off of your statement in the last questioning period here, and it said that your comment was the inventory is not a judgment. I just left my district after being out in the 3rd Congressional District of Colorado. I met with the BLM, and they said under the wildlands that they were going to be inhibiting lateral drilling, which would not impact the surface areas at all, but that seems to be inhibiting. The inventory process does seem to be inhibiting and driving and basically classifying it as a wilderness area. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that particular situation. What I meant by my comment was simply that the purpose of the inventory is simply factual, to determine what's out there. You may be suggesting that maybe we don't know exactly what's out there even after we've done an inventory. There may be some debate at least about what's out there, and that's fair. And I think as the previous questioning suggested, I think that is open for discussion and debate, and that's part of the public process that we would have in land use planning.
Okay, thank you. And a lot of this hearing is really about jobs in the economy. I come from rural Colorado. We have a lot of outdoor recreation. We have a lot of oil and gas development as well, and it seems to be actually living harmoniously. You can speak for your counties, but I grew up in mine and lived there my entire life. We value our public lands. We want to be able to protect them. And Ms. Robinson, I think that you'd mentioned in some of your testimony that you were some of the best custodians on that. Do you see these, when we really need to be able to getting America back to work, to reference back to Congressman Kaufman's comments about being able to provide energy for this country to be able to keep the lights on and reasonable prices for struggling families that are out there? Can you see these two elements actually working in harmony?
Well, they have been working, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to address this, because we have been working in harmony, multiple uses in our county, and we do have recreation. We have plenty of recreation. We have tons of hunters come hunting season in the fall on our ranch and everywhere in the county, and everybody is using public lands together, and it has been protected for over 100 years, and we are the center of focus because we have been protecting it, and it's been working in harmony.
You know, I found, and I'd love your comment on this, because I think we often seem to make a mistake. It's either one way or the other. And it's a lot of my purpose, actually, I think, to trying to develop win-wins to where we can work in harmony. We can achieve both goals in a responsible way. I want to be able to protect our land. I want clean water. I want clean air. And I bet if we asked everyone in this room, everybody would raise their hand in accordance with that. But has it been your experience, and maybe even from the outdoor end of the world as well, we've made the observation in the 3rd Congressional District of Colorado where there has been some development of natural resources that it hasn't actually impacted wildlife negatively. Has that been your experience?
It's actually enhanced wildlife and wildlife habitat by creating a varied landscape rather than a mono landscape of a heavy overcast timber area. By opening up certain areas, the landscape and herds, birds of prey seem to flourish in that kind of environment. And I think that's what's coming out now with the latest scientific information regarding forest practices and multiple use issues. You know, this isn't exclusionary of recreational. Right now we have lots of backpacking. We have wilderness area to the north of us, to the east of us, to the south of us, and to the west of us that have people hiking and enjoying it, and the beauty is maintained. But the point is that these additional takings by the federal government and BLM is not an old process, and by their own representation, it's new. And this means that it is an exclusionary, not inclusionary. It excludes a whole segment of people from economic purpose.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar.
Mr. Spilacci, can you tell me that the definition of wildlands is the same as a wilderness study area?
It's not the same as a wilderness study area in this respect. A wilderness study area, that term is actually not used in Section 603, but it's those areas that were designated under Section 603 of the statute. And those areas must be managed so as not to impair their suitability for wilderness until Congress releases them. That is not true of wildlands. Wildlands are managed to protect their wilderness characteristics only so long as the BLM land use plan requires that they do so, and that can be changed at any time.
So it goes through a holding process?
The wildlands designation, I wouldn't call it a holding process. It's a designation of what the BLM has determined on that particular tract of land to be the highest and best use for that particular tract of land. It's a judgment call that some may disagree with, but it is a judgment call that's being made by the land use managers.
It actually takes into account minimal standards, does it not?
I'm not sure what you mean by minimal standards.
Well, it doesn't have to go through the wilderness study requirements. It has minimal requirements of not the 5,000, but also it only has to have one characteristic of a wilderness area, does it not?
Well, what I would say is it has to go through whatever process the BLM decides is sufficient to protect the land, to protect the characteristics that it thinks are important. But again, I would emphasize that through the public process, the BLM has the discretion wide discretion to decide whether or not particular land should be protected or whether or not particular wilderness characteristics should be protected. So there is nothing in any way automatic under the policy. It is simply a way in which we look at that issue and make a considered judgment as to whether or not protecting those wilderness characteristics is a good idea.
I just see minimal standards being evaluated down, not carrying, I've seen that we're reverting back and we're trying to carry a past law forward, and it really isn't. Mr. Metcalf, I enjoy the wilderness as well, and jobs in regards, and their resources drive our economy. We have to have a diversified economy, do we not?
We certainly do.
And so in order to utilize our resources right, it allows us to enjoy nature, does it not? If
That
we
is
have no oil and gas, we're not going to get to the wilderness areas, are we not?
neither are mutually exclusive of one another.
But if we don't have means for utilizing our resources in a proper manner, we're not going to be enjoying the outdoors, particularly wilderness areas, because they take some traveling too.
There's no question.
Thank you.
But look, can I just add to that? You know, there's a question here relative to what the outdoor industry is advocating. Let's take an area like the Vernal Basin that Mr. McGee was referring to. You know, I had the great pleasure of getting out in Governor Arlene Walker's plane, the King Air, to fly over that area because she was of the belief that perhaps that area should be protected. So we flew over the whole Vernal Basin. It's a huge area. It is in oil and gas development. We're very supportive of that. But what the outdoor industry is really seeking is that the area of Deso and Grays, one of the great wild rivers still in America, that you have to get in a lottery to run that river. People come down there. I've been through it. It provides a great deal of economic generation for the area. And what we're advocating is that that is one of these areas that deserves protection. I believe under this action, it will temporarily get protection. So the real question is it all or nothing? Or are there some lands, some things like the Grand Canyon, the Tetons that deserve protection? Are they deserving, are they as important as drilling every oil well or every gas well? And it's the industry's belief that we as Americans, as a civilized society, do believe that some of these iconic landscapes really do deserve protection and preservation because they generate so much income from active outdoor recreation.
I understand, and I think that I live in Flagstaff, Arizona, that had a wilderness area that went through some mismanagement.
Yeah.
And we're suffering some consequences of that. And I think that's the caution that we have here is that we didn't have some common sense in that adjudication. And when we're talking about wilderness areas, we're taking things to a point where there is no return. And we want to make sure that we're doing it fairly and make sure that we have some ways of compensation on that. Because, frankly, the Schultz Pass fire is an atrocity that should have never occurred.
You know, I'm not familiar with that area, but I will say that we're talking about multiple use. And I think this is what this action of Secretary Salazar's does do. It protects multiple use because currently we have multiple use and we are at risk of losing multiple use because these lands that we're talking about currently protecting and inventorying are currently in a wilderness state or they would not be up for this potential inventory. So what we're trying to do is maintain the integrity of this country's multiple use philosophy and approach. If we don't do this, we do lose multiple use because there are certain types of incompatible use. Just as I referred to in a civilized society, we do not put a big factory by a school. We do not put residential by other areas.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from Alaska.
Mr. Chairman, this is more of a statement in the sense that if I thought that the BLM and its professionals were able to make decisions, I might say this has some merit. But I've been through this for 40 years. And I have watched the interest groups that say, okay, you let this lease, but you didn't take in consideration before you let the lease, we'll file a lawsuit. And that professor knows that. The lawsuits have been used and manipulated the laws that we pass to the benefit of taking away the rights of other people. And usually out of New York or Miami or San Francisco. And they don't really care about these counties, these small countries. When I say countries, you should have been countries. That's what I wanted Alaska to be, and I got voted out. But the fact of the matter is I've watched this wilderness battle. in Alaska. And I've watched how it's been subverted by the interest groups that file lawsuits, the great, big lobbyist interests of the greenies that do not want this country to survive and don't care about those people that work for a living. So, Mr. Chairman, that's a statement, so I don't have a great deal of faith in the Solars, the Secretary, the administration, or those agencies that say, we're going to save more wilderness when there's so much wilderness already. Millions of acres of it set aside. Now they're going to take the one agency that had BLM lands, there was multiple use, and say, oh, now we have to consider it as wild lands. What's the difference between wild lands and wilderness? Nothing, Mr. Chairman. It's semantical words. And so that's a backdoor approach, doing what Congress says we will not do anymore. We'll have this body of land for resources and development for the good of this nation. And Mr. Chairman, I'm going to tell you, we're not going to tolerate it in this Congress as far as I'm concerned. I'll cut all their funding off. Every nickel that's being used, they take and subvert to Congress as our intent. Right in this hall, right in this room, we put millions of acres aside, and enough is enough. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Appreciate that. Gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop.
You want me to follow that? Before you give me start counting my time, I would like to ask unanimous consent for the Utah Association of Counties, Utah Multiple Use Coalition, USA, All Western Business Roundtable, American Motorcyclists Association, Western Energy Alliance have all requested a hearing and have submitted letters or documents on this topic opposing the wildlands policy. I'd like that to be presented for the record.
Without objection, it will be part of the record. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you very much. I have a whole lot of questions for everyone here, and I apologize. I'll get as many as I can through here. Mr. McKee, you're commissioner from my state. Let me start with you, if I could, and just walk through the process. I think what Mr. Markey, Mr. Holt, and the gentlelady from Hawaii asked were some significant questions in the last round and were not quite answered properly. So let me talk about the RMP, the Resource Management Plan. Every area for BLM has to have an RMP, how they're going to handle the land. Now, the one in your area, how long did it take, the most recent one, how long did it take to develop that?
Thank you. The Federal Register was sent out, I believe it was April 11th, 2001. It was signed the end of October 2008, so it was a 7.5-year process.
Was there public comment in that process?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the professionals on the ground, for whom I have very little disregard, they're great people. On the BLM, they conducted it, they did the inventory. That's why we were talking about how the inventory has already been done. They did the inventory, took 7 to 8 years, depending on where you were in that process. This is the process Secretary Salazar said was a rush to judgment. And in that, they looked at the land for wilderness characteristics. Now, I understand in Utah, they came up with 2.8 million acres of land that had wilderness characteristics. But since the concept is wilderness is not all or nothing, they developed kind of a scale of those. And those professionals on the ground said 400,000 of that 2.8 million had wilderness characteristics to the point that they should be managed for their wilderness characteristics. The 2.4 million acres had some characteristics but were not to be managed because there were other issues that were available. Now, is that correct so far?
Correct. And if I could just add, in my area, there was over 400,000 acres, to my recollection, that was analyzed. There was a separate alternative that was looked at, Alternative E, to look at wilderness character, specifically to look at that very issue. We spent two extra years to go through that process. Now we've done that. That was fully done. BLM, it was their professionals on the ground that went through and did this. We just get through with that. We have a signed resource management plan, and now we're turning it upside down to do it all over again.
So this is the issue at hand that the commissioners are talking about, the governors were talking about. What Secretary Salazar's order did arbitrarily was taking the resource management plan that went through the law, obeyed the law, and had the input, and he's saying, I don't like the answer, we're going to start all over again.
Absolutely.
Without a reason, rationale, or justification of why they don't like the answer.
Absolutely, and that's why we're standing up for the resource management plans. We might not have agreed with everything in there, but at the end of the day, that was the public process, and we're standing behind them.
Let me shift gears here, if I could, for just a second. Mr. Meyer, I'm going to see how far I can go. Mr. Meyer, if I could, I do appreciate your response and your questions in here. I like the fact that you emphasized how the so-called Norton Agreement, which has been vilified by a lot of people, has been upheld by the court system and also is held by this administration, say they weren't going to change it at any time. Now, am I right, though, in saying if you go back to FLTMA in Section 102, the policy is, unless otherwise specified by law, the planning and management of inventoried lands must be on the basis of multiple use and sustained yield?
That was the decision of Judge Benson in the litigation challenging the Norton-Levitt agreement. And I should, I guess, clarify. Of course, the best thing to do is read the decision itself. It speaks for itself. Professor Squilacci is correct that Judge Benson dismissed the case on procedural grounds, but then he went on to say, if an appellate court should deem my decision on procedural grounds to be incorrect, I'm going to go ahead and opine on the merits of the agreement under FLTMA and NEPA. And in that context, he said it was legal under both.
So the circuit court looked at that. They did not overturn what Judge Benson said.
They affirmed him on procedural grounds.
Okay. Can I ask your opinion? Because one of the things that was said by the judge in the district court stated that if relief from this process should be sought by environmental groups, they might ultimately come through the political process. How would you interpret what he meant by that?
That they weren't going to get what they wanted in this courtroom, so their option was to go to the legislative branch or the administrative branch.
We could flip that side around here, that if indeed the administration wanted to have a wildlands policy, they could also use the political process. They could come up to Congress and simply say to us, this is our idea, make it statutory. Is that process not available to them?
Well, of course it is, Congressman.
You mentioned in your report the transition to green. I'm assuming you know what I'm talking about.
Yes, sir.
And that the transition to green had an idea similar to what we are hearing back in 2008 when it was presented to the Department of Interior?
This was a document put together by, I think, 28 environmental groups, providing their basically wish list to the new Obama administration on what they ought to do on environmental issues across the administration. They identified 3 priorities for BLM. This was one of the 3.
So on page 187, 194 through 191 through 194, what is here before us now as a decree by the Secretary was exactly, specifically mentioned, almost verbatim, by these special interest groups.
It's more nuanced than that, Congressman. What they wanted was...
I've never been nuanced. What are you talking about here?
They wanted to come in, I think, and simply say that the Norton-Levitt settlement was no longer enforceable within the administration. Secretary Salazar did not say that. He said he was going to not stand by it, but he was not going to overturn it. So what they've done is find another route to achieve basically the same goal.
Okay. If I can, how much time do I have, sir?
You have minus 1 minute and 25 seconds. Yeah. Yeah.
I run through those red things all the time, too. That's
yeah,
one of my problems. I apologize.
Well, I mean, in deference, I don't see anybody on the other side whose time, so I am being a little bit, I mean, Mr. Labrador is next, and if he's recognized for 5 minutes, if he'd like to yield, I'm sure you'd be appreciative of that. Mr. Labrador.
Mr. Chairman, I'll yield 2 minutes to the good gentleman from Utah.
If you have questions, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'll have just a few questions. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Metcalf, I don't represent Utah, but I actually lived in Utah some of the happiest years of my life. I met my wife there, and I have a son in Utah right now who is going to college. And I appreciate the work you're doing, and it sounds like you have a very successful business. I don't know if you were here when the ranking member spoke, gave his opening statements. He was very upset because over the last few years, we've had no wilderness designation, yet we've allowed gas and oil companies to take some of the public lands. Over that same year period, it sounds like you said your industry has been the least impacted by the recession. So I'm having a hard time with your testimony because I really appreciate what you've done with your private business, and I really appreciate that you have been very successful. But yet, without having to find any new wilderness areas in the United States, you and your industry have actually done very, very well. Can you explain that to me?
Sure, I'd be glad to, and thank you for the question. First off, it is a global industry, and we benefit immensely from the brand that is Western America. That's number one. Number two is that there are groups, outfitters, wilderness schools that have been hurt by some of this. You take the some of the oil and gas development post Norton Levitt out by Deso and the White River in that area, people quit operations there. I mean, I know that for a fact. So there were people, outfitters, schools that were hurt from this. At the same time, on a larger scale, until you actually start to manage the lands differently and begin to auction off the bids for oil or gas development or coal or whatever, the lands are still in a pristine state and still usable by people. I think the point here is that once you begin to lose those lands, they're lost forever, but it takes a while for them to be lost. And a case in point is when we're talking about the oil industry, Utah has $5 million acres under lease, but only 1 million are developed at this point in time. So it takes obviously a while for the oil industry to develop those, and they have quite a bit of inventory to do. But my point is the lands are still many of them are still in a pristine state and are still usable as pristine wilderness wildland recreation venues.
But my point is, under the current plan that we have, we can have it's not mutually exclusive. We don't have one industry hurting the other one. It sounds like both industries can thrive, and we can actually allow one industry to actually do better and help us be more energy independent.
Yeah, I think the point that we're trying to make is that this is not, and I think this is the same point you're trying to make, this is not a winner-take-all battle. It is one about how do we find a thoughtful approach to managing these lands. And the point of the industry is that within that thoughtful management approach, some of the lands do need to be preserved. And since I spoke about Deso and Grays, this is a great one. You have a vast area of a lot of oil and gas development, but there's this one wild river, which has the potential to be the longest wild river in the lower 48. Still possible, but it's wells are going in, it's beginning to change. And the question is, will we have the backbone and the guts for the industry, for the preservation of a great draw to Utah, be able to preserve that corridor that's from sight and sound to make this one of the great wild rivers in North America.
Mr. Myers, he just mentioned a thoughtful management approach. Do we not have a thoughtful management approach right now to preserve the areas that are pristine?
Yes, Congressman, we do. And in fact, under the NEPA process, the BLM has a regulation that has a stated preference in the regulations for a consensus-based approach to management.
Now, I'm also a lawyer, and I think about, in my career in the law, I was always looking for that new angle that would give me the ability to maybe file a new lawsuit or do something different than what was being done before. What kind of havoc is this new process going to create for the future?
Well, I think what's happened is that the Secretary has stated repeatedly in his order and in the manuals that wilderness characteristics are now a high priority for the BLM. By definition, if one thing's a high priority, something else must be a low priority. FLTMA does not distinguish on that basis. It states a number of uses and values and resources, but doesn't elevate one over the other. By elevating one over the other in this process, those who are now on the lower end of the priorities are going to feel as though their rights and opportunities are being transgressed. That usually leads to litigation.
And, okay.
Time as gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey.
Very briefly, Professor Squillace? Yes. Could you just give us the 1 minute you want the committee to remember after you're gone? Can you give us that one?
Yeah. I'll try.
Okay.
I know this feels contentious, and I know that both sides feel very strongly about what they're saying, but I hope that we can all agree that good management requires that we know something about the resource. We know as much as we can about the resource, and if we know that land has wilderness characteristics, then we need to use that information to make a judgment about whether or not protecting those lands is a good idea or not. That, to my mind, that's all this debate is about. The Secretarial Order does not require that we protect lands that have wilderness characteristics. It requires that we do our best to know what's there and to make a reasoned judgment, a considered judgment about what the best use. If we decide that oil and gas development is more important on a particular tract of land that has wilderness characteristics, that's allowed under the policy. So I hope that we can come away with this notion that this is just good policy, this is good management of our public lands, and it deserves our support.
Thank you. Mr. Metcalf, can you give us the 1 minute you want us to remember in the committee?
Okay, thank you. You know, I think the most important point I want to make, because we just were talking about it, is that we are talking about good, thoughtful management. Is that occurring now or is it not? And relative to this question about or is that happening, especially, for example, by the BLM, if you look at the BLM's Vernal Research Management Plan, it's a 1-inch thick document primarily on oil and gas, and there's not a single mention of the potential impact of that on recreation, hunting, angling, and tourism. So what this is really about is attempting to come up with truly a thoughtful approach to managing our public lands in a balanced way between recreation and the jobs that that brings on pristine wild lands, as well as the extractive industries.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Flores, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for testifying today. It's interesting. I can identify with you, Mr. Metcalf. I was CEO of a $150 million company until I decided to do this. And Commissioner Robinson, I'm part of a multi-generational family that grew up in a small county with 5,000 people and about 250,000 cattle, so I know what you're dealing with. I was glad to hear that, Mr. Metcalf, all of you or that you and each of the commissioners agreed that you can have coexistence, peaceful coexistence between good land management and recreational activity and extractive activities. Mr. Metcalf, I have a question for you. You talked about you're part of a $46 billion industry. Where does that money come from that people spend in your industry?
Where does it go, or where does it
Where
come
does
from?
it come from?
It comes from the jobs that they themselves have. That could be in the outdoor industry. That could be as bankers or investment bankers. It could be as...
It comes from the economy, the national economy, right?
Yes.
Right, from a robust national economy. This policy interjects a new level of uncertainty into our land management process, or land inventorying process. Uncertainty hurts businesses, is that correct?
It can.
Okay.
It's a dynamic world out there, let's face it.
Right. There's every $1 change in the price, increase in the price of gasoline reduces discretionary income by about $120 billion. What sort of impact is that going to have on the recreational industry if gas prices go up to $4 or to $5? What's that going to do to your industry? And we've seen what it's done in the past. So,
you know, I'm challenged by your question, sir, because we have 4 million acres that are leased for drilling development right now in Utah, and they're not developed. We have 11,000 permits for drilling rigs, of which 4,400 aren't even in use. So I don't understand where the issue is relative to lack of lands available to drill on, or the lack of permits that have been given out.
Well, what we're trying to do, what we're saying is that an arbitrary redlining of, first of all, just because you lease an acre of land doesn't mean that there is some sort of resource under it. The way the leasing rules work, you sometimes have to lease big footprints so that you can try to extract the resources on a small postage stamp of that footprint. I'd further like to say that even if you drill on property that is in a pristine state, it doesn't mean that it's not pristine after you've concluded those operations and after the resources have helped our economy. Where I'm trying to go with this is, what is the impact of when we arbitrarily reduce our ability to have access to resources, and we raise the cost of doing business on our economy and lower discretionary income? What does that do to your business?
Yeah, let me begin by responding to the first part of your question, though, which was about being able to return the land to its pristine state. I spent 2 winters as a roughneck throwing chain on oil rigs in Red Desert, Wamsutter, Baggs, Kemmerer, Echo Canyon, Utah. So I'm familiar with the industry and what it does and doesn't do. And no, some of these sites can never be returned to any kind of pristine state. So I just want to clarify that. I think the question is, for the amount of land that we're asking to be protected here in Utah and the West, is that really meaningful in the price of oil? And I think if you really brought an oil expert into this room and talked to him, they would tell you absolutely not. It's not a meaningful amount of oil.
Let me help you out a little bit. I was in the oil and gas business.
Okay.
And I know what the regulations require. And they require us to put the property back in its original state. And I can tell you that I have some experience with this. I understand that about drilling for oil and gas. So I don't think you're going to win that argument with me. So I ask you again, what impact is higher oil and gas prices going to have on your business?
If there's a relationship to what we're talking about, I don't see it, but higher oil prices affect all of us in the economy, of course.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
There's been a request for another round, and I will recognize myself and immediately yield to the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop.
All right, let me try something. Mr. Metcalf.
Would it be okay for, may I ask if it's okay for Mr. Abbey to take a bathroom break at this point, waiting for?
Mr. Abbey, yeah, sure you take that.
Would that be okay?
Mr. Abbey can, if you can do it within 4 minutes.
Oh, there'll only be one round, one round of questions?
Yeah, I'm not going to ask unless you want to ask.
Okay. Oh, okay. No problem.
Am I free to go? Yeah. All right. Like I say, there are so many other questions I wanted to ask, but Mr. Metcalf, last time you were here, I gave you a pass. I can't do it this time around here. I would like you to provide, for the record, one answer, so you don't have to do it right now. You apparently were at the presentation, the unveiling of this new regulation in Colorado. I would like you, for the record, in written form, to tell us how you knew about it, who gave you the invitation, when you received the invitation, how you were prepared to be there at this particular moment. A whole lot of other people weren't. But this is where I wanted to talk to you, because your testimony here has sounded very good when you talk about the ability. It's not an either-or situation. We should all live together. And that what we should have is an equal footing for all those multiple uses. Problem is, that is the status quo. That's what the RMPs were doing. What this proposal for wildland does is shift that status quo to give one of the multiple uses an advantage over the other multiple uses. And so, yes, it is the federal government picking winners and losers. Now, I'm very grateful that you are a successful entrepreneur and you're making lots of money in this. I think that's wonderful. There's no reason that should happen. But here is the question I want to go, which goes to something that the two governors were saying. I'm assuming you know what the WPU is in Utah. This is the weighted pupil unit for education. This is the, okay, then I'll show you. The minimum amount of money for educating one kid through a year. And in certain areas, like necessarily small and existent schools, they add to that. Utah equalizes, and they have always equalized in maintenance and operation before I got to the legislature, and I was 26, so you know that was a long time ago. And they are equalizing in capital outlay right now, which means if a local school district can generate enough revenue from their local sources to meet that WPU, they don't have to get anything more from the state. And if they overcome that, they supersede that limit, then that is recaptured and spread around the districts that cannot meet that basic level from the state. When I was in the legislature, we had a recapture program. To your memory, is there any recapture program that has happened in any school district that has been directly related to your industry?
I'm unaware if there is or not. It's not my area of expertise. I apologize.
Well, that's okay, because the answer is no. It has not happened. I am not trying to denigrate tourism in Utah, but I want it very clear, because that was not the focus of your written testimony, which was much harsher than your oral testimony here, as jobs versus jobs. Tourism is an important component, but it is not a component that can bypass the other elements we have, which is manufacturing and mining. Those are the elements that drive our education budget. That's where the money comes, and the only place we have had recapture is from those industries. And when we now come up with new policies that restrict the ability to do that, that is the problem, and that's why it hurts. This proposal hurts kids in Utah. Now, I want Mr. McKee simply to tell me what happened in the amount of the unemployment issues that took place in your county the last time Secretary Salazar decided there had been a rush to judgment, so he decided to fix it with an arbitrary situation, which, by the way, the Inspector General said what Secretary Salazar did was actually arbitrary and capricious and a rush to judgment. What is the impact in your county from these types of decisions?
Bishop, thank you, Congressman Bishop. What happened, we lost we only have 30,000 people in the county to begin with. We lost 3,200 jobs. I will tell you, at the end of 2008, because we're an extractive economy, There's a recession going on nationwide. We didn't feel it, but immediately with those change of policies, we lost 3,200 jobs that fast.
Okay, let me interrupt you because I'm about to run out, and I won't go over this time. Mr. Metcalf, you criticize boom and bust policies. I'm sorry, this policy will create a bust and bust policy, which is exactly what has happened in these counties, and neither what's happening in Uintah County or secure rural school funding can compensate for that or overcompensate for that. I yield back.
Time the gentleman has expired. Does any other member wish to have a follow-up on this? If not, then I want to thank the panel very, very much for, number one, waiting when we had this series of votes, and I want to thank you all for your very good testimony. If there is a follow-up by any member, we would like to have, as was requested by Mr. Bishop and Mr. Metcalf, a written response back in a timely manner. Timely manner meaning within 10 days. I think that would be in order. And so if you could all do that, if there are follow-ups, I'd appreciate it. And with that, this panel is dismissed. Mr. Bishop.
While you were getting the next panel settled, may I ask, under unanimous consent, the following documents be added to the record from the Governor of Alaska, the Western States Land Commission Association, the Association of ONC Counties, the Alaska Miners Association, Resource Development Council, Northwest Mining Association, EP Minerals, the Frontier Gold, and letters to the Secretary from the Governors of Alaska, Idaho, North Dakota, Wyoming, Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah.
Without objection, so ordered. Mr. Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also like to have the testimony from Alaska State Senator John Cogale to be submitted, along with Alaska Miners Association testimony and a resolution from Fairbanks Chamber of Commerce and the Southeast Conference. And you already mentioned the Alaskan governor, did you not? Okay.
Without objection, so ordered. I want to call then our last panel, and I see that Mr. Abbey is seated, and I appreciate your taking the time. I know you've been here, but this is a very, very serious issue, and as you can tell, there's a lot of passion on all sides. You're reminded that your complete testimony, as I've reminded the other panels, will be submitted for the record. You have 5 minutes for your oral testimony, and with that, you know how the lights work. I don't need to go through that again. So with that, Mr. Abbey, you are recognized now for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, and I know it's been a long day for everyone, so I'll keep my remarks brief. I do appreciate the opportunity to discuss Secretarial Order 3310 regarding wilderness characteristics on lands administered by the Bureau of Land Management. The Wildlands policy established under that order directs the Bureau of Land Management to work collaboratively with the public to determine how best to manage their public lands, taking into account all of their potential uses. This is not only our obligation to today's generation, but our responsibility to future generations as well. I might add, it's also required by law. Lands with wilderness characteristics are valued for their outstanding recreational opportunities, as well as for their important scientific, cultural, and historic contributions. Failing to consider protecting these wild places would undermine the careful balance of management mandated by law, a balance that we need for our public lands. I've worked for over 30 years in public service. 25 of those years has been as a BLM career employee. I believe in and I'm dedicated to the BLM's multiple use mission. The BLM has over 41 million acres leased for oil and gas development. Over 6 million acres were offered for lease in 2009 and 2010. Millions of more acres have been permitted or leased for other mineral and energy projects, including transmission lines. We also have over 18,000 grazing permits and leases encumbering 157 million acres. Over 375,000 mining claims have been staked on public lands, and an estimated 190 million board feet of timber will be offered for sale this year. However, multiple use does not mean every use on every acre. The BLM strives to be a good neighbor and a vital part of communities across America. Public lands contribute significantly to the nation's economy and in turn have a positive impact on nearby communities. In 2010, the BLM's management of public lands contributed more than $112 billion to the national economy and supported more than 500,000 jobs. On December 23rd, 2010, I joined Secretary Salazar in announcing clear direction for implementing the BLM's mandate under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act to conduct wilderness characteristics inventory and decide how best to manage the public's land. There's been a great deal of confusion about what this new policy is and is not. Be assured that this new policy itself does not immediately change the management or status of the public lands. The BLM's new manual set out a two-step process for inventorying and managing lands that may have wilderness characteristics. The first step is to maintain an inventory of lands with wilderness characteristics as required by Section 201 of the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. It simply documents the current state of the land. Step 2, deciding how lands with wilderness characteristics should be managed, is an open public process undertaken through BLM's land use planning. A decision may be made to protect lands with wilderness characteristics as wildlands or to manage them for other uses. For example, the BLM may determine the impairment of land with wilderness characteristics is appropriate for some other areas due to other resource considerations. I've heard concerns that the new wildlands policy has put a halt to new projects and will prevent important economic activity in local communities. This claim is false. Recently, a potash lease proposal in Utah was approved by the Bureau of Land Management through our new process. Using NEPA, the BLM has undertaken a review of a proposal to offer a competitive lease sale for potash on Sevier Lake, a dry lake bed in southwestern Utah. Following the issuance of the Secretarial Order just 2 months ago, the BLM completed an inventory of the lands involved and determined that the area does not meet criteria for lands with wilderness characteristics. Secretary Salazar and I are personally committed to working with Congress and key stakeholders to ensure that the wildlands policy that we have proposed and are implementing will work. This policy provides the public with a strong voice in the decisions affecting their nation's public lands. Working cooperatively with our stakeholders and being sensitive to local needs, we will ensure that all of the potential uses of the public lands, and let me repeat that, all of the potential uses of the public lands and the BLM's multiple use mission are taken into account when determining how best to manage those lands.
That was right on time. Thank you very much, Mr. Abbey. I appreciate that.
I've had a lot of practice.
Well, that's well. In that case, Mr. Abbey, we might call you back here many times to continue that practice. We'll start with a round of questions, and I'll recognize myself. In the discussion and the testimony that I've heard from the governors and certainly from the commissioners, is that this order adds an area of uncertainty into how these lands will be managed. So my question to you is pretty specific. What guarantee can you give to us that if Congress legislatively releases WSAs, that legislation would not in fact be nullified by adding that legislative released land to the wildlands category? What guarantee can you give us that that wouldn't happen?
Well, let me say this, Mr. Chairman. We respect the congressional process and have included in our planning manuals, which we just released last Friday, a provision requiring that congressional action be taken into account in all of our planning decisions on how we would manage lands with wilderness characteristics in the future.
Well, you recognize that, but I just laid out a scenario where we release lands, and then that means that this order would be in effect. I'm asking you, how can you guarantee that that would not be affected by this order? That's the specific question.
Again, we would defer to your release language that you would include in your wilderness legislation.
So So what you're saying is that you are imposing another step on us legislatively to do something that you're doing administratively.
No, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that we respect the actions that the Congress takes as far as designating areas as wilderness.
Well, let me interrupt you.
Other areas as not.
Listen, I appreciate that, and you respect the actions that Congress has taken. If I heard testimony once, I heard it a number of times today, that there is a process for designating wilderness areas. And in the minds of those that were testifying, they were suggesting that this usurps that or cloudies it up. Now, is that respect for what the law is that's been in effect for some 40 years?
Our policy, our initiative does not designate areas as wilderness. It identifies areas with wilderness characteristics, and using our very public land use process, we'll make a determination of whether or not those lands should be protected to protect those wilderness characteristics, or we would make a decision to allow other uses that might impact those.
Director Abbey, I want to ask you again, going back, and I would like you to respond to me, not only here orally, but in writing specifically. Can you guarantee, and how that guarantee would be, that this order would not nullify that order of taking the land out of WSAs? Could you respond to me in writing to that question?
We will.
Okay. I'd like to yield to to the gentleman from Utah. Balance of my time, which is 2 minutes.
Let me just ask then can I also add to some other written requests then the following?
Give us your list.
To what extent was the Wildlands Order, now you already answered this, the Wildlands Order was not initiated or development in your office in BLM, is that correct? Yes or no?
We did propose the wildland policy. We wrote the policy.
Okay, then, to what extent was it initiated and developed in the BLM office? And these are I want for written report. Who were the key people in the department who led that effort? And I also want to know what group or individual outside the department were involved in developing the wildlands policies. So those are three things. We'll give you, obviously, this stuff written down again.
Okay.
I would actually like also you to define one other term that you used with the chairman, which is congressional actions. For indeed, the Secretary has justified some of his decisions in the past by potential actions that may happen. Justified some decisions because Congress would have done something that would be stronger than what he did. I want to know specifically if when you talk about your respect for congressional actions, that means something that actually took place in Congress or what was introduced as a bill or might possibly come from here. I want to see how that phrasing is defined. I also want to say that I took from heart your concept that you want to work with Congress. I'm sorry, the action so far of introducing this the day after we got done with the lame duck session, just before Christmas, to come up with the third of your guidance manuals last Friday, just before this, does not give us a whole lot of comfort level that you really are wishing to work with us. Had the department come to us with a proposal for legislation to create a new wildlands policy, that's working with Congress. We don't have a great deal of warm and fuzzies that you really want to work with Congress. It looks as if you want to circumvent that process. You haven't built that relationship, and the department desperately needs to do that. Time's up.
My time has expired. I think you get the sense, and we may have time for a second round. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey.
Thank you. Mr. Abbey, as I read your testimony, 2010 saw the highest level of oil production on BLM land since 1997, and the second highest level of gas production ever. Is that correct?
Yes, it is, Congressman Markey. Production of oil and natural gas shows an increase above what was produced on public lands since 2009. As far as oil production, we've had 4 years of successive increases from production on public lands.
So you're putting the drill into drill, baby, drill on public lands. Now, in your written testimony, you state that energy companies are producing on less than 1/3 of the acres that they have under lease. If that's true, could we double or even triple the oil and gas production on public lands without even issuing a new lease?
I wouldn't go that far, because each lease doesn't necessarily have equal production. But I would say that we are quite pleased with the actions that have been taken by the industry to move forward with, to develop their leases. That hasn't always been the case over the past several years. But because of the market, because of the price of oil and gas at this point in time, we are seeing more activity on public lands.
Okay, so what impact would the wildlands order have on oil and gas production on public lands?
It would have no impact on existing leases.
None whatsoever. Now, please describe the public process required by Secretarial Order 3310 to determine how areas with wilderness characteristics are to be managed.
Well, first, what we are asking our offices to do as part of the review of specific projects or as part of their routine land use planning to inventory public lands and identify those public lands that might possess wilderness characteristics using the mandatory criteria as defined in the 1964 Wilderness Act. At that point in time, if we identify lands with wilderness characteristics, it doesn't change the status of those lands until we go through a very public land use planning process. That includes all kinds of input from members of the local communities, elected officials, members of the public, all stakeholders, to help us analyze the various alternatives that are under consideration through that land use plan process to reach a common sense decision.
Okay, and critics of this policy assert that it will create a de facto wilderness wherever you move. And the order itself clearly allows uses of some area with wilderness characteristics that might impair those characteristics. Can you provide some examples of how that might work? How is that different from management of designated wilderness? That is what you would do in this wildlands process.
Well, we certainly have much more flexibility relative to lands with wilderness characteristics or designated wildlands than what we would have in areas that have been designated by Congress as wilderness. For example, if we identify public lands that are managed by BLM as lands with wilderness characteristics, and through our planning process determine that the highest and better use of those particular parcels would be to allow a right-of-way, a transmission corridor to go through those lands, then we could make a decision to allow that corridor to go forward. Under designated wilderness, that would not be the case.
Mm-hmm. So you have much more latitude, discretion.
Much more.
And that allows you then to make distinctions that if something was already designated wilderness would be illegal for you to do so, huh?
It would. You know, again, we purposely wrote into our manual sections in the Secretarial Order the discretion that we sought and need in order to best serve the American public. There's a lot of things that may occur in the future that we don't have good information today, and that as we go forward and address future uses, we will have the discretion using our land use planning process to amend those land use plans if areas had been designated as wildlands and to do something different than to protect those existing wilderness characteristics.
Okay, well, I think the Secretary has acted within his discretion, and I think that you're acting in a way that reflects the fact that this is not wilderness and that you have to, as a result, make a lot of tough decisions, which I think you are doing right now, and I appreciate that, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you.
The gentleman did, again, a very good job on that, and I appreciate the gentleman from Massachusetts. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Alaska for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Abbey, my concern is this whole process, especially in Alaska. Under the Alaska National Interest Land Claims Act, and ELCA, you're aware of that act, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
Okay. You know, this act provides sufficient protection, this is Section 101, for the national interest in the scenic, natural, cultural, and environmental values on public lands in Alaska. At the same time, provides adequate opportunity for satisfaction of the economic and social needs of the state of Alaska, its people. Accordingly, the designation and disposition of public lands in Alaska pursuant to this act are found to represent a proper balance between the reservation of national conservation system units and those public lands necessary and appropriate for more intensive use and disposition. And thus, Congress believes the need for future legislation designating new conservation system units, new national conservation areas, or new national recreation areas have been abbreviated thereby. Would you agree with that?
I would say Congressman, that the ANILCA also recognizes the Secretary may identify areas in Alaska which he determines is suitable for wilderness.
No. Section 1326, no future executive branch action with withdrawals more than 5,000 acres and action from public lands within the state of Alaska shall be effective. In fact, the wildlands designation is administrative withdrawal, and that's against the law. And as you, my governor is going to sue you, and I think he will win. You're trying to circumvent the law.
There's nothing.
You have 86 million acres of land. 56 million acres in Alaska have been set aside already. There is enough, as I said before, of wildlands in Alaska. And what you're trying to do now is stir up the pot to make sure that you can have another opportunity with your administration to take away the rights of Alaskans and this nation to develop resources on those lands, because you took the rest away from us right in this room. You're trying to circumvent. There is no difference between wild and wilderness. None. And I've listened to you talk, and your administration, I listened to that lawyer on that end, and if I could thought you could work, if you could work one-on-one without interference from outside interests, because you will be sued. You will not have any development on BLM lands. All whatever you say, it will happen. You'll be sued. I watch it time and time again, because you are circumventing this law. And when we get done with you, hopefully, in Section 1320, notwithstanding standard provisions of law 603 of the Federal Land Policy Act of 1970 shall not apply to any lands in Alaska. That's the law. You agree or disagree?
I disagree.
You disagree, and you're a lawyer?
I'm not a lawyer.
You're not a lawyer. What did your lawyer say about that?
They disagree with you.
Oh, that's fine. That's the administration. And I agree with Mr. Rob right here. I want to find out who's instigated this program. You didn't instigate it. You would take credit for it?
I will take credit for it.
You take credit for it. And did you consult your lawyers?
We did.
And they disagree with what I have to say?
They did.
And Mr. Chairman, I suggest one thing. I would like to say this committee ought to file a lawsuit too, because this is against the law. This is the law. And you circumvented it, thumbed their nose at the Congress. That's what you did. That's what you're doing right now. Thumbing your nose at the Congress. Because that's the law right here, written. I was here when this law was written. This is what Ted Stevens wrote. This is what I wrote. And this is what the Congress agreed to. And your administration stinks right now, because you're going against the law. Follow the law once in a while, and you get a lot more done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Time of the gentleman had not expired, but he yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey, or no, yeah, the gentleman from New Jersey, and then the gentlelady from Hawaii.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, mild-mannered Chairman. I thank you for coming, and I apologize for the long wait that you've been subjected to. It really is good of you to come. We did talk with a lawyer who was a witness a few minutes ago, and he stated that what I might call the Salazar wildlands policy is very consistent with the policy that existed prior to the Norton land policy for many years before that. Do you agree with that characterization?
I do. The process is very similar. Actually, the Secretarial Order that Secretary Salazar issued provides us greater flexibility than what we had in the previous process.
Okay. Now, it's been claimed that the policy is unprecedented, and you're just saying not really. It's a return to what existed before. But to expand on this thought a little further, is it the case that this policy is substantially similar to the policies of the Forest Service, the Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the policies that they have had for decades?
Well, the policies are similar from the standpoint of the need to inventory lands that are managed by those bureaus or agencies. They take that same information and use it through their land use planning process to reach decisions. Areas that are recommended from the agencies themselves for possible wilderness designations are then forwarded to members of Congress for you to make a determination of whether or not to actually designate those areas as wilderness.
And I'd like to, at risk of asking you to repeat yourself, I'd like to revisit the question that Mr. Markey asked about public participation. How would you characterize the degree of public participation under the policy before December and the policy since then?
Well, the dilemma that we faced prior to the Secretary's initiative is that we did not have a process since 2003 in the settlement agreement that was entered into by then Secretary Norton and Governor Leavitt from Utah. There was no emphasis given at all to inventorying public lands to determine which of those public lands might have wilderness characteristics, much less given to how best to manage any of those lands with wilderness characteristics as part of our land use planning process. As a result, our offices were doing their own thing. There was no consistency in how they were dealing with similar issues across administrative boundaries. One of the first issues that was raised to my attention when I was brought in as the director of the Bureau of Land Management from BLM employees themselves is that we need a wilderness policy to direct us on how to deal with the issues that are coming before them every day, every opportunity that they are conducting land use plans. We have been working on this policy since 2009, since the fall of 2009. And we finally came up to something that the Department of Interior would support, and that's what you see that was issued as part of the Secretarial Order.
Well, thank you. That's a very clear answer. I appreciate that. Changing the subject from policy just to a factual question. You comment that there's nearly half a gigawatt of wind power installed on public lands. There are tens of millions of acres of public lands with wind potential. What is your projection of what will be installed and on what sort of timeline? Are you prepared to answer that at this point?
We could certainly get you some background information and a list of projects that we are reviewing this fiscal year, 2011. And we have some other projects that have been proposed, but we haven't started the NEPA process at this point in time.
Are there under consideration as much as already is installed or more?
The potential is for much greater than what's been approved. The same the same holds true with solar and geothermal. We are very committed to helping this nation diversify our nation's energy portfolio, which is very, very important, not underestimating the need for continued conventional energy sources. We understand that we need to continue to make appropriate public lands available for the development of oil, natural gas, and coal.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Time of the gentleman
very much.
Expired. The gentleman from Utah. Well, it's your turn, and then. Yeah.
Let me try and go through 6 questions, if I could, to you very quickly. You've offered the 3rd guideline on Friday, as I understand, right?
I'm sorry, what was that?
You offered your 3rd guideline on this issue on Friday, is that correct?
We issued 3 manuals on Friday.
Okay, now, is there any precedent for that? I know in the past you've done on one particular issue 2 different memos. Is there any precedent for having that many manuals, guidelines, et cetera?
They were all related to the Secretary's initiative.
Is there any other program where you have done that many guidelines, of which you are aware?
Not recently.
Okay.
I'm sure that that's not the exception, but not recently.
Am I under this, you've already had resource management plans that have been placed into effect. Is the decision of the Secretary voiding all of those resource management plans?
No, they're not.
If it doesn't void that, that means you have to amend those resource management plans.
Not necessarily.
So you're claiming you don't have to go through the APA process to amend a resource management plan under this provision?
What I'm suggesting is that our manuals and the Secretarial Order requires us to ask our field offices to review their existing land use plans to determine whether or not they are consistent and in compliance with the Secretarial Order. Based upon that review, they will come back to us and let us know what amendments might be necessary.
Until that is, so then you will go through the amendment process?
Not necessarily. If they come back, Congressman Bishop, and let us know that their land use plans are consistent with the Secretarial Order, then we don't necessarily have to amend any land use plan.
All right. And you're not requiring a non-impairment standard until that time takes place?
We are reviewing specific projects, undertaking inventories as a result of any specific project that would come before us to determine whether or not those projects are being proposed on lands that we have determined to have wilderness characteristics. And as part of that NEPA process, we would make a determination of whether or not to approve that project.
The Energy Policy, and thank you, I appreciate it. The Energy Policy and Conservation Act, I think was done actually in the end of the Clinton administration, required an inventory of all onshore federal lands, an estimate of oil and gas resources, and was required to be part or utilized as part of the BLM plan to identify areas in that. And that was part of the resource management plans that you've used in the past. Is that still part of your process under your new guidelines, your new manual?
Information relating to mineral potential is part of our land use planning.
So it's still, okay. Let me ask the hypothetical that you were trying to get to. Let's say that after 3 years, the BLM decides that those wilderness characteristics on certain land do not need the extra protection that one may say. Does that mean you would have to do another re-inventory before you would change the management plan for those parcels?
No, it doesn't require us to re-inventory, especially in that type of timeline. It would require us to go back and amend that land use plan decision.
You will not have as much money in the next upcoming years as you've had in the past. It's probably a given. Are you really sitting there and wanting to tell me that you would rather spend money on this proposal than you would on wild burros, wild lands, fire suppressment issues? You're going to have to make those decisions. Is this the priority that's going to take money away from those other entities?
The priority for the Bureau of Land Management is to manage public lands for multiple uses. We believe conservation is part of those multiple use.
I'm asking for prioritization. Are you willing to do that?
We do that through our budget appropriation process.
And if you have less money, are you willing to take it from burro management, wild horse management to do this?
We are looking at actions to reduce the costs associated with wild horses and burros every day.
Sir, I appreciate everything you've said. Your answers to Representative Markey were spot on accurate. But what you said was, as has been said by others, is that this new proposal gives you a great deal of flexibility. I hope you realize that is what has us a concern. It is totally possible that there may never be a conflict. We may never get on your case with this land possibility. But when you have elements in there as talking about what congressional actions may be, or what the average visitor may view, or islands of whatever the noun is you put on that prepositional phrase, there are problems. So I'm going to ask you the last question here, and I won't extend the pain any longer. When you're in my office, I ask you the last question. I ask you this question. I still haven't got an answer from it. The professionals on the ground that did the RMPs, you don't criticize their work at all. Is that correct?
I have not criticized their work.
And that's consistent with what you said. What is it then about the RMP plans that were done after those years and years of study that would impel the Secretary to say, we don't like the answer, we need to redo it again? And I want to be very specific. What about their work product was wrong?
No one has said that their work product is wrong.
Then why aren't you just going forward with their work product?
Because we want them to go back and review their land use plan to see if it's consistent with the Secretary's initiative.
For what? What is the smoking gun that makes you want to redo this?
We would like to know that in the 6 resource management plans that were completed in Utah, the most recent planning that was completed in Utah, there were 4.8 million acres identified through BLM's inventory process as possessing wilderness characteristics. As a result of that land use plan, there was 400,000 acres that were identified to protect as natural areas.
Mm-hmm.
We're just looking to determine what criteria was used by the district offices to make that determination.
Here's the problem. If they are smart, if they did it the right way, their decision should be able to go forward, unless there is something that gives you pause to think that they were wrong. Is there one specific thing that gives you pause to think they were wrong?
Not at this point.
Quickly.
I'm done, sorry.
We may have another round. So, gentlelady from Hawaii.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Director Abbey. I'd like for you to bear with me. I don't have the years as my colleagues do, so they use all these different acronyms that mean nothing to me. So can you tell me, what is the difference between wilderness characteristics and whether and how that interplays with, I think I heard the chair use it, WSA, which I believe are wilderness study areas. Is there a relationship between the two?
The similarities is that wilderness characteristics and areas that were identified as wilderness study areas were all based upon possessing mandatory wilderness values. Those would be size, naturalness, and opportunities for outstanding or opportunities for solitude or outstanding recreation.
You mentioned, I think, in one of your testimony that only Congress can do a wilderness designation.
That's true.
So, wilderness study area, does that have any basis in law? Does it have any statutory authority? Is it equal to a wilderness designation?
The Federal Land Policy and Management Act directed the Bureau of Land Management to conduct inventories of all public lands when it was passed in 1976. The Bureau of Land Management went out and identified those lands with mandatory wilderness characteristics. Under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, we identified those lands as wilderness study areas, which included not only protecting those wilderness values that existed, but also to do further analysis and studies and then make recommendations to members of Congress of which of those areas that have been identified as wilderness study areas the agency recommends for designation by Congress. The agency completed that work in the early 1990s. Since that time, there's been 8.6 million acres of lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management that has been designated as wilderness by Congress. There is still 13 million, a little over 13 million acres that are being managed as wilderness study areas, which means we are protecting those wilderness values and not allowing any actions that would impair those wilderness values until Congress releases those areas from wilderness study status.
So, to understand this correctly, Congress can then disagree with you as to whether it's a wilderness study area? Is that correct? I mean, that wilderness study area could then be a wilderness designation.
Congress would have to pass legislation to release areas from the wilderness study area status.
Right.
They would also have to pass legislation to designate areas as wilderness.
Is there anything that reverses the wilderness to something else? In other words, if lands are designated wilderness, can Congress then designate or undesignate it? Or is it the designation out of the wilderness study area? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Well, Congress always has the discretion to go back and revisit areas that they have designated as wilderness. I'm not aware of any time they've done that, but they certainly have that discretion. Usually through legislation, when they designate areas as wilderness, more times than not, they will release areas that have been identified as wilderness study areas that they chose not to designate as wilderness for other purposes.
And my last question is this 15-year study that we hear so much about. Now, the 15-year study, is that tied to what we're calling the regional plans, or is that a separate thing that there's the requirement that in 15 years that all these areas are studied and you either include them in wilderness study areas or you do whatever with it? What is the secret behind this 15 years?
Well, we normally believe that the life of a land use plan is around 10 to 15 years. Now, that hasn't been a case because the West has been changing so rapidly that we see a need to amend land use plans routinely for purposes like renewable energy development, where we have done programmatic EISs for wind energy or solar energy, that we will then go forward once we have the analysis completed as part of the programmatic EIS, and if necessary, we will amend a land use plan to accommodate those type of projects in certain areas.
So absent that, is there a requirement to at least review every 15 years, the maximum outside date?
There's a requirement through policy for us to routinely review our land use plans to see if there's a need for updating it.
Thank you. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady. At the risk of doing one more, I have some questions, and Director Abbey, you've been very patient. I hope your wife will understand that patience because you're going to probably get home much later, and I hope the food will be warm when you get home. So my wife's in Washington, so I know mine won't be. So
my wife's in Mississippi, so I'm not sure she's holding the meal.
Well, we're both in the same place then. All right. I just have one observation, and with a line of questioning that we have heard from a variety of people, and this is kind of what I heard. Nobody disputes, And I think the court has affirmed that BLM has the authority to inventory lands on a regular basis. That doesn't seem to be the issue here. But the sticking point seems to be, and I would like you to be specific where what I'm going to say, where you get the authority to make this distinction, is BLM land is used for multiple purpose. And it appears that the dispute is one of the uses is given a higher authority than other uses. And that may be where the sticking point is. So I would like you, if you can, to tell me specifically where you have the authority under BLM, under land inventory, or however that is characterized, to give higher authority over other uses. And in this case, of course, the fear is, from what the testimony we have heard, that wilderness or wild lands, i.e. wilderness, at least one of the members here felt there was no difference, is a higher authority. So could you give me that?
Mr. Chairman, I think the challenge that we face in dealing with lands with wilderness characteristics is the sensitivity of those characteristics, the wilderness values themselves. If we allow certain uses to go forward to impact those wilderness characteristics, it may be that those values are lost forever.
Listen, that is a judgment call.
That is a judgment.
There's no question. I'm asking where you get the authority, under statute to make that determination. Because that, for the first part, is a judgment call. I recognize that.
Mm-hmm. There is really, as we go forward with our land use plan, Mr. Chairman, all uses are on the table.
Right.
We look at the alternatives.
I know. In the dispute here, as I pointed out, it appears from the testimony that all of the uses, higher authority has been given to this wild lands. And I'm asking again, where do you get the authority to make that determination of which is higher priority? It could be another one. You happen to make, in this case, wild lands. Where do you get that authority statutorily?
I'm not sure it exists statutorily.
Well, then how? Well, that begs the question, why did you do it?
Because we wanted to demonstrate the values that we're placing on wilderness characteristics to make sure it does not get lost as part of our inventory.
But that is a judgment call that Congress makes under the Wilderness Act of 1964. We heard ample testimony on that earlier today, that we have that authority, and now you are saying you don't have the authority to do that, and yet you're doing that.
We have the administrative authority to go forward and do land use planning based upon our policies that we ourselves enact.
Right. I'm asking you, but again, I mean, you answered that you have no authority to give higher authority to multiple uses. That you just answered that, and yet that's what you're doing.
We're using the authorities under 201 and 202. Again, it's not elevating any single resources higher than anything else.
Well, maybe I'm missing something, but I thought I heard very specifically that you don't have the authority to do this, to make this determination of which multiple use is higher than the other. You're just doing it. And that's the fear that we hear from those that are impacted by this, the uncertainty that I spoke about earlier. I have to say, Director Abbey, that disturbs me when I hear you say that you don't have that authority. So,
the point being, Mr. Chairman, is that we want to make sure that lands with wilderness characteristics that we ourselves identify through our inventory process, consistent across the western United States, are given due consideration as part of our land use plan.
But you have no statutory authority to weigh one over the other, as you just said a moment ago.
I'm not aware of one.
All right. Mr. Bishop.
One last question to try and clarify something Representative Hastings earlier said. He asked about WSAs, whether they would be eligible for this. Let me just ask specifically, if a WSA were released by Congress, would it then be eligible for wildland designation?
It would qualify as lands with wilderness characteristics, or it would have never been a wilderness study area.
It would be eligible then, unless Congress passes another law to specifically say you cannot do.
Congress provides direction to the Bureau of Land Management every day through their release language with wilderness legislation.
Okay, but it would be eligible then for wildlands if it were released from WSA status?
It could be, but let me repeat myself. We would defer to the language that would be in the wilderness bill that was passed by Congress to provide us with directions on how to treat these lands.
I know, but we're giving you flexibility. Let me just say at the very end, I do appreciate you being here and staying this late. We apologize for keeping you here this long. This is an important issue for a whole lot of people. This hearing, I'm sure, is about to conclude, but this will be not the last time we are talking about this particular issue again. But I do appreciate your willingness to stay here and answer these questions to the best of your ability, and I thank you for doing that, sir.
Well, I appreciate those remarks, and let me say, we do know the importance of the Secretarial Order. We would have never issued the Secretarial Order if we did not think it was important, and to have, you know, this type of discussion, to be able to defend the actions that we've taken.
Maybe it would have been better if we'd had this discussion before you issued the order. Never mind.
Gentleman yields back, and I apologize to the gentlelady from Hawaii. So, okay. You have no questions then? Well, I too want to thank you, Director Abbey, for being here. This was a long day, and as I said to at the outset, I know that you will be asked back here, and of course we welcome you. And I do want to say, as you can tell by the testimony, sometimes passions ride pretty hard on these issues. That's not something that you are not aware of. But the best way to have a logical discussion on this would be to respond to what our requests are of you, as we did when we asked you to write. If you could do that, that helps. There has been times when we have Secretary Salazar up here on Thursday. There are some times we weren't afforded that opportunity, and we just don't think that is the proper way to do business in a transparent way, because this is a government of the people, as you well know. So with that, I want to thank you very, very much for being here and for your patience. And I see some of the other witnesses in the audience, and I want to thank you also for your traveling here and coming to this meeting. With that, the hearing is adjourned.